Welcome, everybody, and thank you to SACEP for hosting this and for the opportunity to present today on developing coaching as a corporate strategy. So let me just introduce myself. I'm Neil Bierbaum. I'm a Master Certified Coach with the International Coach Federation. I've been coaching for just over 20 years, 21 years. So I got into coaching when coaching was just becoming a thing in the mainstream. I thought I was way ahead of the curve, and then I qualified as a coach, and suddenly all around me were all these coaches. It's like when you decide to buy a particular car, and then suddenly all the cars become, you see the similar ones. So yeah, coaching emerged at that time. That was early 2000s, 2004, 5. And so I've spent about 21 years coaching, a lot of that in the executive coaching space and the corporate space, and across a wide range of industries and at all levels. And I think what's interesting, let me just finish that. So I trained in ontological method of coaching, consciousness coaching, and then developed various added on other elements as I went. And then more recently completed a master's in leadership coaching at Stellenbosch Business School. So I added that academic aspect, which was very interesting in terms of getting the scientific piece around evidence and doing some actual research into coaching and kind of learning a lot through that process, which I'm going to share with you today. And I think one of the key things to say that over 20 years of coaching, there's a question I have around how much progress have we made? And that's on three levels. One is towards being a profession. There's been some progress, but not as much as we would like in terms of the things that we coach on. So I often say, I'm still having coaching on the same themes that I was 15, 20 years ago. And I often wonder at what level are we going to get that level of leadership transition at scale, and then maybe start moving to the next level. So that's another question of interest for me. And the other one is in terms of corporate integration. So how integrated is coaching with corporate strategy and with the corporate, especially in terms of input into the coaching process and feedback back into the organization. And I've seen an improvement in the last couple of years, but it's taken a lot longer than I would have thought. And I've always been surprised at how little supervision there is of coaching. Big organizations who send you someone for coaching and there'll be no leader input, there'll be no feedback mechanism, and they spend all this money and you coach in a bubble. That'll be one of my terms that I'll use today. So that's something that I've noticed, and it can catch you out as a coach and in terms of the organization. And obviously we want to improve on that for coaching as a profession and for coaching in organizations. And so what I'm going to do today, I'm going to probably just stir up a little bit and challenge some coaching myths. So I tend to be a bit of the coaching Grinch or the coaching rebel. I was watching Pluribus. I don't know if any of you watched Pluribus a while ago, and the woman Carol, who's the virus doesn't affect her because she's such a Grinch. And I was like, that's me in the coaching business. I'm that guy or that person, often arguing with people about what we really believe in coaching. So I'm going to challenge a few of those today. I don't necessarily say I'm right, but I think they're valid questions. So let's begin. And one of the things that I discovered in my studies is that the science is very much in agreement that coaching works. So in the academic field, the view is we know that coaching works. We've done enough studies of that. There's been meta studies done, and we know that it works. And so what we don't know is how it works. That's the next stage of development. And what we found, so this is a summary of a summary, because this presentation would be really boring if I went through all the benefits and the factors for success. I do have that, but that would be a separate conversation. That maybe is a little article in itself. So these are the kind of benefits that science has supported with some significant validation. So that's things like there are personal development benefits, so people themselves benefit. There are relational benefits from coaching. There are work performance benefits. And indirectly, there are sponsor benefits, such as increased employee satisfaction, productivity, leadership, effectiveness, coaching culture, developing and instilling a coaching culture. So those are things that the science and the evidence kind of supports. The question we get to, and we'll address this in more details later, is how do we measure ROI in the coaching, in business when we're doing coaching? How do we measure ROI? And I've got some challenges to that as well when we get to that topic, because we know broadly that coaching works, but in order to give specific numbers, is a lot more difficult, and to be able to relate a coaching intervention to a particular pulse score increase or something like that is very difficult. Obviously, as coaches, we want to take the credit, but there's probably many factors going on. And so what do we really want to measure as coach in terms of coaching, and how do we want to gather that evidence and feedback that to the organization in order to make a case for coaching? So that's really going to be the essence of what I present today, and I'll move into that a little bit later. I just want to touch on one or two other things as a lead into that. And where I'm going to focus is a lot around the touch points or the integration between the organization and the coaching process, the process of feeding into the coaching process, and then feedback and evidence coming back out of the process, which I really think is the key piece that we want to deal with. So again, just some things to be aware of. So there's a range of factors that support positively impact coaching, and a range of factors that negatively impact coaching. So whether the organization, whether the manager supports it, whether enough time is given to it, those are obvious ones. And then there's a long list. So as I said, that would get boring if we presented it, but we can go into it separately. Two things that are relevant for today's conversation. The one is that coaches and coachees can focus more on personal development while the sponsor is looking for business results. So there's a bit of that tension, and I'll address that today. And then the other one is that coaches very seldom measure their own performance to improve their practice. They tend to rely on informal feedback. And that's what I was describing earlier. A lot of my experience has been that there's not a big demand for rigorous feedback into the organization and integration of the learning back into the workplace, and making sure that is sustained. Like we say, okay, here's 6 sessions, that's your package, go. And then it's done. But not everything gets achieved in 6 sessions. Sometimes it gets done in 4. And sometimes we need to have a look and have more further touch points along the way in order to land the coaching effectively and not be coaching in a bubble. I'll give some examples of that. So one of the things I discovered in my studies was that the coaching very closely maps to the adult learning cycles. Kolb's model of the adult learning, which goes through 4 stages, and Chapman, a South African who did a PhD, one of the first PhDs in executive coaching, and he showed that the coaching framework or process maps very closely to the adult learning cycle. And this is relevant to the conversation today. So basically what happens is we start the process with a problem. So we might report that problem, reflect on that problem, and then in coaching in particular, we then present that with the coach, and we think in partnership with the coach. So that's the second step there. Then in coaching, we design experiments. And so this is typically how adults learn as well. They learn not just by rote as children would do. They learn for relevance, for what's meaningful. So they're always going to need to experiment and practice what they learn, and then come back and do the feedback. So they will go and execute their learning, test, and gather evidence. And this will happen no matter, in all forms of adult learning. The key piece for coaching, though, that although this is the process for coaching, is coming back to the report and reflect. And I'm talking about this at both a micro and at a macro level. And here we start getting into the meat of it. So at a macro level, we're talking about, are we reflecting on the coaching process as we're going along, feeding back into the organization and checking that there is progress instead of coaching in a bubble? And are we reporting and reflecting at the end of the process and formally feeding that back into the organization? In my experience, there's not a lot of that happening, and we tend to coach in a bubble. What also tends to happen is that coaches want to adhere very strongly to this idea that we should be non-directive, so and non-prescriptive, not telling the client what to do. And so my research was into that exact subject, and I found that coaches are reluctant to really pin their client down on what have you done, what have you learned, how did you apply this, and get that feedback, close that feedback loop at the beginning of each session, because they don't want to be directive. And I believe they missed an opportunity there, and sometimes the coaching can drift and perhaps become a little aimless, and certainly loses out on some of the rigorousness of what's possible there in the coaching. And so the reason why that gap happens is because of some executive coaching myths, which I'm going to challenge now and be the Grinch. and just throw those up there, because these are the things that coaches often use to defend themselves in not giving feedback into the organization, and also that we use in the process of coaching and appointing coaches and getting the process started in the first place. So the first one is around coach selection, and that feeds automatically into chemistry sessions. Let me say this about coaching. The biggest myth about coaching is that what makes coaching different is what makes coaching work. So people always say, oh, coaching is different because it's not consulting. We're not the expert. We ask questions. We say that in a way as though there's some magic in that. That is what makes coaching work. It does make coaching work, but it's not the only thing. And it's not, sometimes we take that to a religious degree almost, and as though there's some mythical magic hidden inside there. And when it comes to coach selection, and there's no science that says this is the best kind of person to be with. The overall relationship is much more important. The overall context, the overall support, many other factors are important. Nowhere is coach selection a critical criterion for success. And there's very little science to support any form of matching of coaches, like this kind of coach and this kind of person should do better. In fact, the only one piece of research I could find was that people with differing learning styles, so if we take the Kolb model and the different learning styles, that people with opposite learning styles often benefit, a person will benefit from being coached by someone with a different learning style. And because it expands their perspective. And that's probably, I would say that's very often true, that you want to be coached by someone who's not your exact match, who doesn't have your exact pattern. And that's one of the problems with chemistry sessions, which we follow religiously with coaching, is that how do we know you're not just going to choose someone who's going to make it easy for you? How do we trust that chemistry session is the best way to select a coach? If we're talking about coaching moving towards being a profession, if I'm a professional, I should be able to coach anybody. You put somebody in front of me, I should be able to coach you. And I really do believe that's the case. And in my experience, sometimes we take chemistry sessions a little far. There's times when, for example, we decided we're going to do a program where we're going to introduce certain frameworks to the people, and then we're going to coach them on those frameworks. So I was going to introduce the frameworks, but then the person insisted, no, they must have chemistry sessions to choose their coaches. But those other coaches weren't exposed to the same frameworks. So that created an unnecessary layer of complexity to the program, instead of saying, okay, let's have you as the coach and allow that process to emerge. So that's one of the ways in which, and it's one example I could give others of where we tend to be quite religious about chemistry sessions, and really we should be able to just come in and do the work. And a good qualified coach can. So I think we waste a lot of time and energy on that. Client confidentiality. So often coaches might use that to say, I can't talk about my coaching clients, and they use that as a way of not giving feedback or not giving sufficient feedback into the organization. I find that the whole process around the link between organization as a sponsor and their rights in the business, that wasn't a major thing in the early days of coaching. Coaching was done very much in a bubble, but it was probably around 2014 that Mark Kahn, who's head of HR and strategy and other things at Investec, he wrote a book called Coaching on the Axis, and that's become the standard reference for saying that the client as sponsor has a right to give input to the coaching and receive feedback from the coaching. And I find that generally a lot of the stuff that gets discussed, people are happy to provide as feedback. And I would say the more important criteria there is that you agree with your client that if there is feedback, I will check with you first on what I say. And that gives you full right to give feedback to the organization as long as you check with the clients and you let them know this is what I'm going to give feedback on. And they have a right of refusal as against a blanket confidentiality statement. And then I mentioned the coaching process being non-directive, non-prescriptive. I mentioned that one actually earlier, where coaches say, oh, I can't tell the client what to do. I can't force them to stick to this program because that would be prescriptive. My research was specifically on that, and in practice, coaches are doing that, even though coaching theory doesn't support it. And So there is a strong move towards that. People are recognizing, especially as coaches have become more experienced. I found that the more experienced coaches are prepared to give information as input and do recognize the need that sometimes you have to be prescriptive. If you get told you need to coach for this aspect of that report feedback, you need to bring that into the coaching. And there is an increasing willingness. And the key piece of research there has been done by Dehaan and Nielsen. I can do all my fancy academic references here if I have to. But the facts, and that followed on from earlier research that was done, that the key piece is autonomy, so client autonomy. So giving the client permission to accept the direction or not, to accept this is what the coaching is going to be on or not. And that's the key piece there is, do you have the client's buy-in? Are they truly in agreement? And if you don't, you need to work on that piece as against just avoiding it completely. I hope I'm making sense on that. So just some references, some examples of the times that I've been caught out by not integrating with the organization properly. So I got caught out coaching in a bubble, and it was a big fright for me. So I was coaching a band of leaders in a multinational pharmaceutical, very senior crowd. And one of the leaders, I got called in one day by the CEO and said, are you aware that this person that you're coaching has 3 grievances against them and half the team wants to resign? And I'm like, no, because in the coaching, they look like a star client. And I was a bit taken aback. And then I went and I investigated and I found that, in fact, yes, the stuff that we were apparently coaching on wasn't reaching the ground. It wasn't being experienced by that person's line reports. And so I then went and I started examining exactly what we were doing. And I noticed that this person was giving me all the right terminology and saying all the right things, but lacking the specifics. So if I started asking for a greater level of detail and examining further, I found that there wasn't any there behind what they were saying. They were giving the platitudes. And this emerged, and eventually we found, that this person really wasn't coachable and wasn't going to play the game. And so there was a disciplinary process there. But the key thing there was coaching in a bubble and not being exposed to enough of the organization, not getting enough feedback from the organization. What's the evidence of progress here that's actually happening? And so from there, I developed my model, which I'll share later, which is very much to have milestones and checkpoints along the way where you're getting the client to bring real evidence back in and really show that progress. Obviously, as a coach, you read your clients as well, looking for evidence of progress as well. Another thing that's happened is sometimes where you coach the wrong person. So I can't say how many times, when people get sent for coaching and then you're listening to them and you can hear that this person's actually not doing much wrong, but the boss or their line manager who sent them is the one. And so end up coaching the person to manage their line manager more effectively and just become better at managing that relationship. I've seen that happen effectively as well. So how do you take that back into the organization and make sure that you're coaching the right person? That's another point of integration that is sometimes lacking that I've experienced. Other times, something I've done is where I'm coaching somebody and then I find out halfway that there's a specific requirement from the leader that was never really communicated to me. And then they ask for a report, and this is towards the end on that particular factor, and not being aware that was what was being coached for. But then I did give a report on this person's capability as a leader, but because I had no contact with anybody else in the organization, they just sent them to me for coaching. I had to give them the report. I didn't give it to anyone else. And obviously they didn't like what was in the report, so it never got to the person concerned. So there's a huge waste of money. And this isn't a big organization. And that was only about 2 years ago that happened. So it just shows a lot of the disconnects that are still happening out there. I talked earlier about coaching ROI, and that's really where I want to go now. And how do we create this integration and link between what the organization's requirements are for coaching as a broad strategy, but also for this particular individual within this division, this team, and how do we feed that back into the organization? And one of the things I have as well, a gripe with ROI is if we are to really be about triple bottom line and people, we know that coaching, as I said earlier, does a lot for people. So a lot of the benefit that comes out of coaching is it develops better people. It helps people to feel rewarded in all the work that they're giving. It helps them in their personal relationships. I often get feedback, oh, my wife or my children said this. That's when you know that coaching is really working. And so there is that qualitative element. It's also very difficult, as I'm going to show, to translate coaching into a number in order to satisfy the accountants, the shareholders, etc. And so we need to really examine that and look at, are we really going to chase after a purely quantitative ROI figure and always try to relate it into some external performance or feedback measure? Often coaching isn't happening in isolation, so there's multiple factors affecting that. I'd love to take credit as a coach, but it's not always only the coaching that has brought that about. Or can we go for a more qualitative approach where the case made for coaching is also qualitative? So we can rely on that broad evidence that I mentioned earlier, and there's more detail to that. We know that coaching does this. Here's the evidence for this particular person. These are the particular gains that they made, qualitative. And we happen to have some external ROI measures that are quantitative as well, when those are available and possible. So that's the broader context of what I would say needs to happen, how we should address the ROI question. And to illustrate the difficulty of this, I'm going to take you through a model now which helps you to understand this difficulty in measuring coaching outcomes. And I'm going to use a model which comes from E.F. which is 4 quadrants model. It was later adapted by Ken Wilber and is used in integral coaching, so it might look like that for you, but I'm using the original one from E.F. Schumacher, who wrote a book called Guide for the Perplexed. Fantastically titled. When I saw that title, I had to read it, and it turned out to be this framework, which has been very useful for me in many ways. So we have 2 domains, which is the individual and the collective domain. So there's me on my own and everybody, me interacting with you out there. And then we have our interior world, which is me with my thoughts and you with your thoughts. Nobody can access that interior world. You can't access my interior world. I can't access yours. And then the exterior world, which is the one out there in front of me. And so this creates 4 quadrants, which leads to 4 fields of knowledge, as them, or 4 fields of awareness, as I like to call them. So this one obviously is the intrapersonal. That's me inside myself, inside my thoughts. Only I can see what's going on in there, and my individual capacity. So that would be where we would find self-awareness. So that's my knowledge of my own inner world. Second one is what we would call relational. If you go back to that slide earlier where I said, what are the benefits of coaching? There was personal development, there was relational, and there was work output. So that all maps to this interestingly. So here we have other people's interior world and my ability to reach in and see that. So do I know what's going on in your interior world? Am I able to access that as information? I like to work with this as a model for establishing EQ, because it shows that EQ isn't about being touchy-feely. It's about asking the right questions and being curious to find out what's going on in someone else's inner world, and then the positive feelings emerge out of that. So emotion is an output, not an input of this practice. So EQ and empathy falls into that quadrant. Then we have the field of leadership, which is the interior world. So my interior in the collective space. So in other words, that would be where leadership, identity, brand, and things like authenticity come about. So in other words, do I know how others are perceiving me? And also, am I allowing and making enough of my inner world visible to them so that they understand my thinking and are not taken by surprise, so that I can delegate effectively, etc. So that's the inner world of leadership of myself as it is experienced out there in the collective. And then we have the last one, which is the outer world that we can all see, both you and I can see it together, and that's the world of objective phenomena and data. I hope I'm making this clear. So there's all four of them together. And where this translates, where this gets interesting, is these are basically four categories of coaching goals. So here we can see that these are self-mastery goals. So this is when somebody wants to mature in some way that is personal to them and internal. So they find that they get very irritated with people, and they know that it's because of certain things in their own makeup. And so it's an interior goal that they need to work. Then there are EQ and empathy goals. So this is where I want to understand other people better. I want to be able to relate to other people better, become more curious, ask better questions, understand my people better. Then we have impact and influence goals, which is the leadership quadrant. So this is where I want to recognize the impact that I'm having and how I matter to others, the willingness to have them rely on me, and understanding how I can, what I can do to influence them better. And that involves understanding how they are reading me as against the EQ and empathy, which is how I am reading them. And so that falls into that category. And then the other one is performance goals, which is like your sales figures, the objective stuff. So now we go in and we can see the difficulty with measuring and getting an ROI on this is, how do you measure and get evidence for intrapersonal goals? Well, that's very difficult. So the only real source of evidence you can rely on is something that's self-reported. So someone's journaling insights, sharing insights in the session, shifts in beliefs, attitudes, etc., and providing examples. So this is something that really is between the coach and the individual, that the coach needs to be able to examine and say, this is a substantial piece of evidence, this is a substantial change, I can see how it's benefited you, but it's very difficult to link that to any kind of external immediate measure. It might benefit them for the next 5 years. It might emerge in 2 years' time where it really has its impact. Their overall growth and development will improve because of this as they mature. So that's a very hard one to measure. EQ and empathy is slightly easier. So there's obviously the self-reported stuff, but here we can claim some third-party evidence. So we have, for example, a new behavior, but formal feedback can come into this. So we can start looking at 360s, team engagement or scores, and also informal feedback, formal and informal feedback. So I always joke, like when somebody says, oh, my wife said this or that, then I know that it's landed, that they've carried the behavior not only in the workplace, but home, and they've had spontaneous feedback from somebody. Sometimes they might get an email or feedback from a line report or something. This is valuable evidence to record as qualitative evidence for progress of the coaching. Similar with the impact and influence goals, same kind of thing where there would be new responsive behaviors reporting. So somebody's reporting how they shared with their team, or they did this for their team in a way that they would have done it differently previously. 360 and engagement scores can come into that, and the informal feedback as well. So those are the relational pieces. And then here is the one where we can actually get the more objective actual results, sales figures, etc. Commitments kept, or you won the promotion, or you delivered the speech, or there's an actual physical objective outcome. So we can see there that creates some challenges in terms of quantitative feedback, because all of these things can ultimately impact a pulse score or a response rate or those kind of feedbacks that we rely on. But often the coaching isn't happening in isolation, and it's happening over quite an extended period, and there's multiple people in the team and multiple things happening. We have to find that balance. And as I'm saying, if we just chase a number, then we might miss out on the real value of coaching and these kind of layers of complexity. So while we're trying to link coaching results to a number, and we do find the kind of measures that are possible there, we also got to know that link is probably somewhat tenuous, and the real value of coaching is often in these kind of qualitative outcomes. And if we need to justify coaching, well, we've got two things. We've got the broad academic evidence that coaching works. Here's the broad kind of ways in which it works, and we can put together a case document for that. And then here, in this particular case, here are the qualitative pieces that worked for this individual, and we can show how those link back into those original ones that we looked at earlier. If you look at these fields, they're intrapersonal, relational, leadership, and effectiveness. it'll take me too long to go back to that other slide, but that first slide where I talked about the summary, those are exactly the ones that science has shown if we pull them out as a category. So to make this work at a practical level, I've developed a series, which is not like rocket science, but it sets it out, and it's got one or two elements that are just help with the rigor of the data gathering, the evidence gathering, and the feedback process. So in the beginning, we always have the discovery phase of the coaching. So there's usually a personality assessment, a 360, and line manager or HRBP or input. So I can't tell you for like probably 80% of the coaching, at least I've done, there's been no line manager input, no real input. The person comes to you and says, these are the reasons I went coaching or that I've been sent for coaching, and you work with them. Much more now, I'm seeing people starting to say, okay, we need to involve the line manager, and we need more input from the organization at the start of the coaching process. So that's definitely picked up. And as I said, if we don't have that, we're working a little bit in a bubble. And there's obviously an incentive for both the coach and the individual to want to believe that the coaching is succeeding, but we need to be more rigorous about that. 360 is obviously useful as well. Then we come to the contracting phase. So we have the coaching objectives and the coaching stream. And I like to add as a possibility what I call a learning stream. So what are you going to learn out of this? And that's something that we can contract on, that there's going to be a process. A lot of that discovery happens as we're going, oh, this is what I actually need to learn. Here's how I'm going to go about it. But it keeps us on track, like that there's a parallel learning journey that's happening as well. Maybe the person is discovering something and they're reading about it at the same time, watching some videos on it and accumulating some broader knowledge around that. That in my research shows that happens extensively. Coaches are always saying to their people, here's a book you can read, here's a model, here's a YouTube video, etc. And there's this parallel learning thing that happens. So we can become aware of that, and maybe at some stage we can start to be more proactive about that. The other one that's important is this one at the bottom, which is called the evidence stream. And I'll show you, that's basically agreeing, not with the tightest rigor, but having a look and seeing, okay, which categories are we working at? Has some self-mastery goal. This one is a relational goal. This one is a leadership goal. So this kind of evidence, we're going to rely on your reporting. This one, we're going to look for some 360 feedback. And this one, we're going to invite feedback from your line reports or your line manager or something like that. And so you can get a sense of what kind of evidence you're going to be looking for through the process that's going to help you not get into a bubble and make sure that you're on track. So that's the important piece, I think, that can be added, that can help create that qualitative argument for justifying and verifying the coaching. So that's basically just your coaching sessions, S1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And the CI is client and action. So that's that piece in the middle where you testing an experiment, then you come back to the coaching session. And then the parallel learning, so we can see that increases as we go, and eventually you want that learning process to continue beyond the coaching. One of the good definitions I've heard of coaching is learning how to learn. So you put yourself on a learning path that continues after the coaching. So that's really the output of the coaching, as much as it's sometimes an input. Over here, what I've developed in my process is these evidence milestones. So here in a 6 coaching session, there's a 7th, which is the review session, and those beginning contracting discovery phases. But your actual, let's say there's 6 hard main coaching sessions. At session 3, I would then do that first proper evidence check. Okay, at the next session, I'll say in session 2, at the next session, we're going to do some checks on the progress, and I'd like you to bring some evidence to the session. Maybe you've got some feedback from somebody, an email, something that somebody's reported. See what you can find that can match those different types of goals and see what comes out of it, just so that we know we're on track. Sometimes, if it's a very delicate or intense process, you might even want to reference the line manager. Can you get a report from your line manager? Can you bring them into the session for 15 or 20 minutes to make sure that you're on track? So for me, there's huge value in doing that, because really coaching can drift from that point. People get enormous benefit in the beginning, and then they end up using the coaching to solve problems. I've got this problem this week, and okay, I'll help you solve that. And this problem this week, and I'll help you solve that. But then we're not really moving towards that main objective. And then again, just probably towards the end, gearing the person towards the final review is really saying, okay, are we still on track, and doing another milestone check later on in the process? Because now you've got one more session. So what have we done that we can bank? And what do we really need to focus on in that last session? And then finally, we would have a review phase. So this is where I usually provide a document with the goals, the different objectives set out that we've agreed on, and a field for self-score for providing evidence for what's your ongoing learning journey. And I ask them to prepare that and bring their sort of evidence to the last session. And then we go through that and we agree, okay, and then this becomes like a document that is agreed between us. And the honest truth is, hardly ever had to submit that. There's one coaching organization that I work with that consistently asks for that. So I'm able to translate that. They've got an online process for reporting it, which is very effective. But generally, I accumulate that information and it never really goes back to the organization. But I feel that particular piece would be valuable in terms of making a case for the coaching. Qualitative case, given that there's this research that says that coaching works, and here are the quantitative numbers that we are able to point towards, but we can't prove it with absolute certainty because there was a lot going on at the same time as the coaching. And so that's how I would want to recommend that the coaching process gets integrated into the organization in terms of the input in the beginning, and then that constant feedback and input process through the process and the review process at the end. And just to say as well, on those milestone checks, if it's a situation like that one I described earlier where I got caught out, I might even, if I'm coaching within the organization with a group and I'm exposed to the system, I might even, with permission, go and get feedback from the line manager myself, or get them to come into the session and say, how are we progressing over here? And make sure that we're not getting lost in coaching bubble. So I hope that is valuable for you, and I think that's everything on this. So I think we've reached the end. I'm going to close off now. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much.